So, yeah, just a little bit about this. Stephen and I are actually cousins, so we've known each other since we were babes. But we have very similar interests. We're both writers. We're both very interested in philosophy and psychology. And over the last couple of years, we've been reading different books and different writers together and talking to each other on the phone about once a week, and having what I've thought have been really good conversations. And um, we were just kind of experimenting with how to bring this to more people, and how to kind of start a dialogue with some of these writers, especially some of these classic essayists. And today we're starting with Michel de Montaigne, who um, was actually the first to write the personal essay. He kind of coined the term essay, and so we thought he would be a great thinker and writer to start with. Um, do you have anything to add, Stephen? Or
Yeah, so that's true. He's a great read. I thought we have like a couple, about 5 essays picked out for like the next month or so, and that we're going to be just doing one a week. So hopefully there will be topics that people find interesting and writers that can bring some value to your life and like the things that you think about. I definitely have found that, I mean, not every single essay is something that will um, completely change your mind or make you evaluate something that you hadn't thought of before. But there's tons of great value in surrounding yourself with people who were smart and interesting and good company. So, I mean, at the worst, you spend an hour and have a pleasant time. And at best, you get something that helps you look at things in a new perspective. So I think Montaigne is like a great place to start. He's the progenitor of the essay. Um, what I like most about Montaigne, I mean, his total volume of work is like 1,400 pages. Um, and he is always curious about himself, and he doesn't hold anything very ideologically. So he's happy to go and explore a certain topic and then reevaluate at the very end, being like, maybe I was wrong. He takes a lot of his exploration very easily. He's pleasurable to read. That's always a big plus. And the writing style is very accessible, I found. Hopefully, you guys found that as well. And yeah, I don't know. He's charming and helps you think about aspects of living that maybe you didn't consider before.
yeah, and so maybe for some people, we can just give a little bit of just background of who he was as a person to kind of frame the conversation. Um, So he was born in 1533 in Bordeaux, France, and he was born into a wealthy family. He inherited his estate, and he worked as a public servant. His job was preparing documents for judges in the courtroom, and he did this till he was about 38, and he retired then to his chateau, which by today's standards seems like a pretty early retirement, but in his day, in his upper class, that actually wasn't super uncommon. In a biography I read on him, they said, in the Renaissance, you had your period of civic business, then you withdrew to discover what life was really about and to begin the long process of preparing for death. So that captures a little bit about what Montaigne was up to for the latter half of his life, and ties in well with the topic of this essay. So he began writing, actually. I was reading, one of the reasons he began writing is a friend of his passed away, and he was pretty depressed about it. And, since he was retired, he didn't have a lot to keep him busy, and he found that his mind would just kind of wander, and he began to write as a way to kind of center his thinking and to give him a goal to work towards. So it was actually like partially his writing was for his own kind of therapeutic reasons, but also, as Stephen mentioned earlier, he was trying to really learn about the world through observing himself. And that's kind of a theme that runs through his essays, is this this idea of trying to learn, this idea that personal experience is basically what he held as being kind of the most important, the most pure form of truth. Because he's a very skeptical thinker. And yeah, Stephen, is there anything else you want to add before we jump into the essay?
No, I think that's sufficient. Yeah. So so hopefully everyone was able to read Of Practice. It's about 10 pages long. It's kind of split into two sections, which is pretty common for Montaigne. He doesn't necessarily force himself to just stick with one topic for the entire thing that's titled about that topic. So we thought we would kind of break the discussion into two groups. The first bit is about the beginning chunk, probably about 60% of the essay, which is about practice and his experience of coming close to death and whether or not he sees that as valuable. And then the second half is more about, is talking about yourself a vain thing to do, or is it a mark of poor character?
Right. And we'll do our best to kind of fill everybody in on his thoughts and everything, because we realize that there will be people that have not read. So we'll do our best to kind of break down exactly everything. So yeah, let's jump into it. So the first thing he kind of gets into is this idea of if there is a way to practice for death. And he starts off by saying that, this is a quote of his. He says, "Dying, which is the greatest task we have to perform, practice cannot help us." And then he says, "As for death, we can try it only once. We are all apprentices when we come to it." So he has this idea of, you only get one crack at it. So unlike other things in life where you can practice it and put yourself in close proximity to it, with death, you only really get one shot. And then later in the essay, he says there's many things that simulate death. So even though we only have one chance at it, there are several things that he thinks might prepare us for it. One of which is sleep. He talks about how sleep might be nature's way of kind of preparing us for death. This thing that we do, usually once a day, could be nature's way of preparing us for death. Do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, and like the other one that he talks about is becoming knocked unconscious, which is his own kind of personal experience. So I guess one thing that I am curious about is why we might want to practice for death, and whether or not it has any real, because he kind of says like, when we come to it, that's it. And there are other things in our life that I think are similar. Like if you have a bar mitzvah, or if you're baptized or something, these are things that are suggested to be kind of like a metaphysical change that one undergoes. Like you become a man, or you become saved. And I mean, death is certainly, if there's anything that we actually have a metaphysical change in an experience of ours, death would have to be, that thing. But then when you think about like preparing for religious change of some sort, even if you are practicing becoming a man in some instance, it really does not count as anything in compared to the actual ceremony, you know, that there's no way to do it unless you've done it. And so to me, that makes me wonder if practicing is even important in relationship to undergoing death, especially because death is not something that you can really prepare for the exact moment of experience. You know, I mean, he talks about the
Could I
guy.
comment on what you said?
Sure.
So, so you talk about this idea of like why prepare for death. I know for him, one of the things he struggled a lot with was anxiety around death, and this idea of how to kind of handle the fear surrounding it and the
Mhm.
moment of dying. And he talks a little bit about how a lot of times our anticipation of certain things is actually worse than the thing itself, and that our imagination can kind of run wild. He says many things seem to us greater in imagination than in reality. And he gives this example of a time where he was very fearful of getting an illness. And then he actually got the illness, and he realized that the fear of the illness was actually worse than the illness itself. He says, I found their pains mild and easy compared with my fears. So he makes this kind of analogy to say, he makes this analogy to say, I hope that the same is true when it comes to death, that, our fear of it is just really blown out of proportion compared to what it actually is like. And it made me think of, in cognitive behavioral therapy, there's an exercise where they'll have you kind of rank on a scale of 1 to 10 how bad you think an experience will be that you're anxious about. Say the thing might be, if you have social anxiety, like starting a conversation with a stranger, you might, before you go to a party or a cocktail hour, you might say, okay, it's, I'm really anxious about this. I think it's going to be like a 9 out of a 10. And then what they have you do is, after you actually do it, then you again write out of scale of 1 to 10 what the experience actually was. And my experience with this, and I know a lot of other people's, is it's the actual experience is never even close to as terrifying as we think it will be. So I thought this was a really interesting point, and I never really had thought about this, in relation to death, because I mean, that is like one of the ultimate human fears that we have. And that, like, I think it's a great point that he makes, that this could scale really well in that, like, death itself, if it's anything like these other things, is probably not actually going to be nearly as bad as our imagination thinks that it might be.
Yeah. And I mean, I think I agree generally that practicing or finding an analogous experience and going through it can be helpful in overcoming fear about a later event. But I, like, for example, the lesson of that our fear of a thing is often greater than the fear that we actually experience when we go through it. Like, this could be a thing that we learn and understand through any kind of exercise that we go through, and then rationally we can apply it to other facets such as death. Whereas I feel like practicing, in the moment between right before you fall asleep or right after you wake up, I've noticed that I can tell that I'm about to fall asleep. Like, I've never been able to catch myself in the moment, of when you actually fall asleep. But I notice that I'll start having these strange thoughts, not every time, but usually when I, am starting to measure time by the number of pencils or something that I see on the floor, or some ridiculous thing that makes no sense, I can think, oh, I'm, about to fall asleep. And I wonder that kind of, you can have comfort in that hazy intermediary state. But as far as like whether or not that applies to death, I'm not sure if that assuages any fear, because kind of what I was going to get to, the guy who, in the example that Montaigne gives about the guy who knows he's going to die, and he says, I'm going to go up to the moment of death so that I can have my faculties totally ready to experience the moment, to see, does my spirit go on or whatever. But most people, I think, death is not something that is like preordained at a certain hour. It's something that sneaks up on you. And that even if you have, all the preparation for any task in the world, if you are suddenly caught off guard, like who's to say the preparation will even have an effect? I do think though that there's got to be, that any value in practicing for death has got to be contemporary to like when you're practicing. But yeah, I guess I'm skeptical about the.
Yeah, you're definitely more conscious of your moments before you fall asleep than I am. I can't say I have any kind of conscious memory of the moments before I fall asleep. But yeah, but anyways, maybe we can kind of get into Montaigne's near-death experience.
Yeah.
Which is a big part of this first chunk of the essay. So I can kind of give just an overview of what happened, especially for those who haven't read. So one day when Montaigne was out riding his horse with some friends, there was one of his friends was behind him on this dirt road, and I guess his friend was kind of trying to show off and pass him on this horse, and instead his horse ran right into Montaigne, and Montaigne went head over heels over his horse and went down really hard, and he was unconscious for a couple hours. His friends had to take him back to his house. He says, after I had been taken dead for more than 2 full hours, I began to move and breathe. So he wakes up, he sees himself covered in blood, and he actually thinks that he had been shot, because apparently there was a civil war that was going on at the time. So
and they were hunting too.
Oh, okay. I didn't catch that. Yeah. So it's so bad. He thinks he was shot. He's vomiting buckets of blood. It's very gory. So he's having this experience that on the outside appears very hellish. I mean, just, vomiting buckets of blood, very horrible. But for him, he then talks about this kind of pleasurable, subjective experience that he has after he starts to kind of drift back to sleep again, or not to sleep, but to death. Here he says, it seemed to me that my life was hanging only by the tip of my lips. I closed my eyes in order, it seemed to me, to push it out, and took pleasure in growing languid and letting myself go. It was an idea that was only floating on the surface of my soul, as delicate and feeble as all the rest, but in truth not only free from distress, but maligned with sweet feeling that people have who let themselves slide into sleep. And then he says, my condition was in truth very pleasant and peaceful. I felt no affliction either for others or for myself. It was languor and extreme weakness without any pain. So yeah, this is his experience, and I think this might be why he makes the analogy to sleep. Is that his experience of dying was a lot like falling to sleep. He uses that example.
I think what I liked about this portion, because I remember reading about this event in a biography I read about Montaigne, and then we've read this essay twice now, but I think I went through like a period of being super terrified of death, and probably I still am. I've just like pushed it down, buried it a lot more.
Repressed it. Yeah.
But I remember reading this and feeling, yeah, that maybe it was somewhat misplaced. I mean, I don't think ultimately, because like I said, there is that metaphysical change that happens once you have died, whereas this is kind of the moments up to it. But to read somebody who has gone through death essentially, and especially, I mean, this has got to be the closest one gets in his time, because like, you know, they didn't have those pads or whatever to zap you back if your heart stops. In seeing that he found comfort in going through that experience, that was helpful to me to think about that perhaps it won't be as terrible. And I think, yeah, in those moments between waking and sleep, there is that kind of grogginess to, or like, you know, once you wake up, this is probably easier for people to catch, but when you wake up, like, things don't necessarily make a whole lot of sense in those initial, you know, however long. You're still kind of in your dream state. You're kind of participating in the world, but you're not really in one or the other. And if it is the case that that is similar to the moments that precede death, yeah, that brings me some comfort.
Yeah. So yeah, and he actually says another kind of a quote from this. He says, "In order to get used to the idea of death, I find there is nothing like coming close to it." Um, so I mean, I don't know how much practical utility that has for us who haven't. I mean, I don't know that you should throw yourself off a horse in order to prepare for it.
Suicide to
But
make myself feel better.
right. But not to take away from the comfort this gives you, but just to play a little devil's advocate here. I remember watching a movie by Woody Allen. I think it was Hannah and His Sisters, where Woody Allen's character kind of has the opposite experience of Montaigne. He has I think it's either a near-death experience, or he finds out that he was diagnosed with cancer and then finds out that he's okay. But something for him, and at least in this movie, I know it's a fictional movie, but kind of released his death anxiety, and that like this near encounter with death just made him realize how close it is. And his character actually had like the complete opposite reaction of Montaigne, whereas he kind of turned into this like extremely neurotic person who was just couldn't stop thinking about death.
Yeah.
So I know it's just a movie, but I could see that the near experience of death having different results.
Yeah. Well, and that kind of, this is somewhat tangential, but then it makes you think, is there an appropriate way that one should face the fact of death? Do you know? Because there are, I mean, ultimately, I'm not convinced that there's like a objectively right way to go about doing much of anything. And really, we all have our own personal journey that we're taking, and we have death that approaches at any time. In some sense, the way that we prepare for it is kind of thrust upon us by our personality, for example. So perhaps we are more neurotic, perhaps we are more naturally blasé. But then I think we can also choose somewhat how we face it. And maybe this is where the value of practice comes in, is kind of deciding how you want to face it and how that will affect A, when you die, but then B, how you live and how you are always interacting with that possibility of death. I mean, I remember when I was talking to my dad a couple years ago about death, and he says he just doesn't even think about it because he's like, it's going to happen. There's nothing I can do. And I thought that was totally crazy to just not care because I was more neurotic. But I think that that might be closer to how I want to experience, just in terms of the pleasure that I am then able to experience in my day-to-day life, not being
Yeah.
by the.
Well, and I think what I gathered from this essay too was some of what Montaigne is saying too is that we don't necessarily need to prepare for death, and that our kind of we were born with these instincts to kind of know what to do when we die. The same reason, we don't have to be taught to desire food or to eat. We just do it.
Mhm.
And that kind of when we get there, we're going to know what to do. And that there's these natural things like sleep, which are already kind of conditioning us to what that experience might be like. So no, I don't think that your dad's advice sounds too crazy at all. Cause I mean, I kind of take that as like, I think it's something that like when it comes, I'm going to know what to do. And, you know,
Mhm.
um,
Should we jump to the next section?
sure. Yeah, let's see. I think we should. So yeah, there's a few things we didn't quite touch here, but I think we got to the heart of it. But yeah. So we noticed this essay is kind of split up almost into two separate essays. And Montaigne's very like tangential in his writing style, which is totally cool. So the last couple pages, are kind of around this taboo of talking about yourself to others. So do you want to start this off, or do you want me to?
Yeah.
Okay.
So the second chunk is about whether or not it's right to talk about yourself. And Montaigne really comes down on this, on that A, it is okay to talk about yourself, but B, the problems that people point at in terms of speaking about yourself, being vain or being boastful, really lie in the mind, not in the mouth, and that it is a problem of how you think about and evaluate yourself, and then speak about it, as opposed to um, just the action itself. So it's more about motive than what really occurs. Um, and this is a part that I find it hard to figure out whether or not you have, how to decide if you actually have a good estimate of yourself and your talents or your values, or if you are underselling or overselling them. Like, how do you really determine what is what is in actuality you?
Right. Yeah, and he yeah, kind of as you said, like one of the he thinks one of the reasons there is this taboo around talking about yourself is usually when people do it, they're bragging about themselves. They're talking about all their strengths. They're rarely talking about their weaknesses. But he says somebody who truly knows themselves knows both parts of themselves. They know things they're good at, the things they're bad at. So that person, they should have license to talk about themselves because
Mhm.
they're not just going to say good things. They're gonna say everything.
Yeah.
Um, and he's very adamant about just being honest. He says you don't have to be overly modest and kind of play down your strengths. At one point he says to say less of yourself than is true is stupidity, not modesty. So he's not talking about, just being like overly humble. Um, but he's talking at kind of like getting to the truth. And he uses the example of Socrates as someone who knew himself really well. And of course, the famous line with Socrates is, kind of the more I know, the more I know nothing.
Mhm.
Um, or, the thing that makes me wise is unlike all these other people who think they're wise. I'm at least wise enough to know that I'm not wise.
Mhm.
Um, so kind of like once you get to a certain level, um, you're able to kind of see both parts, the good and the bad.
Yeah, and I think the big takeaway that I found in this part was he seemed to say, when in doubt, check yourself. Like if you think maybe I am being a little braggadocious here, just remember all the other great people who are now dead, who are so much better than you. He says, like the thousands of minds that trample you underfoot.
Yeah. Can we actually read that whole quote? Because I think that was my favorite line in the whole essay.
Yeah, go for it.
Um, yeah. So this is like, yeah, his advice for anybody who thinks they're when they look around them and see other people, they start to, they feel really smart and kind of are getting cocky. So this is his antidote to that. He says, if anyone gets intoxicated with his knowledge when he looks beneath him, let him turn his eyes upward towards past ages, and he will lower his horns, finding there are so many thousands of minds that trample him. So I love this kind of picture of like, you know, if you think you have a big head, just open up a book and,
Mhm.
read one of these past thinkers, and they're just going to trample you like a stampede.
Yeah.
Which I could definitely relate to, even just like reading Montaigne, just like, after reading like a few paragraphs, you just think like, man, I'm an idiot.
Yeah. And that can be a great, circling all the way back, a great benefit of reading essays and enjoying them is that you're both able to expand um, your mind and your beliefs and things, but you're also able to always force yourself to be aware of how little that you actually know. So
Yeah.